Well, I don't need to tell you what that's from. Everyone knows what that theme is from. It's from the most iconic show in the history of television. And if you were alive in the 1990s and you owned a TV, then you would have seen Seinfeld. That is, if you were an American, well, where the good TV is. But as we all know now, Seinfeld is the most popular and successful show in the history of television. And it all started back in the 1990s. And we knew then, as we do know now, that it was the smartest show, certainly the funniest show, and the most relevant show around. Of course, it took a while for Seinfeld to come out of the shadows of its contemporaries like Cheers and Frasier, and later Home Improvement and Friends, the so-called rival sitcoms. But all of this took place around season 4 of Seinfeld, which to this day is still the greatest season in the history of television. It's just an absolute masterpiece. The whole show as a whole is one big stroke of genius. Nothing like Seinfeld had ever been done before, and never that way. Of course, at its core, it was just observational comedy with a lot of innuendo, but it was more than that. It was the best show ever written. People like Larry Charles, not Larry David. Of course, Larry David was still probably the mastermind behind the show, but he teamed up with a seasoned comedian, Jerry Seinfeld, who was doing things differently from his predecessors, and he didn't have to come up with the vulgar language to incite people quite the way that George Carlin or Richard Pryor had done before him, but he was just as perceptive as them. But the thing that most impresses me about Seinfeld is how in the 21st century we're still watching Seinfeld, and a lot of the things still ring true today. A lot of the Seinfeldian tropes are still true today, which leads me to conclude that Seinfeld was just a show about the modern world, wrapped up in a comedy, which is usually the best way to truly examine all the minutiae of our daily lives. But don't ever think that Seinfeld was a show about nothing. It was truly a show without grievances, but it was definitely a show that teaches you something about yourself, about how stupid society is. In the words of Larry David, it's a show without hugs, no hugs, and no learning. But you do learn things. You just don't learn them in the traditional way that TV shows, other sitcoms try to force a watered-down message down your throat. Seinfeld wasn't like that. I'll give you an example. When George's fiancée dies because she's licking toxic wedding envelopes, it's just an absurd thing. But what you realize is that things like that in life happen. You can't explain it, but you move on. There's no lesson to learn from that. They just go and get a cup of coffee. George wasn't happy in the relationship anyway. He finally got his way out. One of the most ingenious escape plans that's ever been concocted on television. It was great. Seinfeld is truly the only show I can think in all of history that will forever be linked to a time and a place, more so than any other show. It is still the most relevant show today. And people can argue that The Sopranos has overtaken it. I don't think so. There's great acting and great writing on The Sopranos, but if you look at the Writers Guild of America TV Guide, Seinfeld has been, in the very recent past, still been ranked as the greatest show ever written and the greatest show of all time. Some people consider The Sopranos to have supplanted Seinfeld. I don't think so. I think that they belong to two different eras, and The Sopranos is a show for people growing up in the 2000s and the 21st century, but it was on the very tail end of Seinfeld, after Seinfeld in 1998, after a very successful 10-year run. But Seinfeld is still the smartest show ever written, the best show ever acted. You've never seen a collection of talent like Jason Alexander, who's really, in a nutshell, it's a performance within a performance within a performance. It's Jason Alexander, who is not particularly known for his comic roles, but he made George Costanza into arguably the greatest TV character of all time, at least in any comedy. There's never been a show with a character like George and all the things that he does and gets away with. But he's really playing, George Costanza is really, in a nutshell, some version of Larry David, who's some version of Woody Allen. Of course, Woody Allen has inspired all of the modern Jewish comedians. There's Julia Louis-Dreyfus, who we have always known to be one of the greatest actresses in TV history, and really just ever. She's probably the most successful actress now because of everything she's done on her other shows. And then Michael Richards, whatever you can say about him, there's never been anyone quite like him. I don't know what it is that he does, but he's insanely funny. Whatever his method is, he's one of the greatest comic actors in a long time. Then you have all the supporting characters, all the guest stars who've gone on to be big time, particularly Bryan Cranston. It was no coincidence that these people started on Seinfeld. They made their bones, so to speak, and they moved on to their own work. And the only show I can think that rivals Seinfeld in terms of laughs would be Curb Your Enthusiasm, another brainchild of Larry David. And I don't want to say that show, of course on HBO with no filter, I don't want to say that they've taken advantage of the freedoms and liberties of saying whatever you want on television. Of course, Seinfeld didn't have that, and it wasn't really there back then. But Seinfeld, of course, probably deserves a lot of credit for paving the way. Of course, in Seinfeld's case, and this was probably to the benefit of Seinfeld, they used a lot of innuendo. They had to mask their jokes for network television. And it made the references all the more funny if you understood them. And it was just ingenious in and of itself. But the show will, hands down, continue to be the high point of the culture of the 1990s, the most culturally relevant show in television history. There's no one that's ever seen this show that hasn't been able to remark about it. There's no one that's ever seen this show who hasn't had the jokes stay on their mind, who hasn't constantly referenced Seinfeld. And it's given us so much. Seinfeld's given us so many references. And not just anyone who's seen the show would recognize them, but only someone who's seen this show would fully appreciate the extent of its influence. It was so ahead of its time. You could compare it to the Beatles, where the Beatles gave us the 1960s, Seinfeld gave us the 90s and the early 2000s. It's sort of like that. It's the most influential piece of art of its time. And just like any art, if you look back on it a few decades after the fact and you can still see it as a gem, then you know it was something great. Seinfeld was a show for the ages. Truly the greatest of all time. And everything else is just yada yada yada.